Welcome back, everyone, to Furthering Christendom. I am your co-host, Mike DeVito, here with Dr. Tyler McNabb. And just a little backstory before we start this episode. I started really studying philosophy in 2016, and what you come to find out quickly when you start learning philosophy is two things. One, there are a lot of really smart people that do philosophy. And two, what I come to find out is a lot of the things that I believed were wrong. And so I ended up having to change a lot of my beliefs because you read the work of these smart philosophers and think, wow, I was way off. But there are levels to that. And there are some philosophers that I've come across who have made me question some of the things that I never thought I would have questioned before. So for example, Peter Singer and his vegetarian, vegan, animal ethics. Prior to that, I'm 300 pounds. Okay, I don't want to not eat a cheeseburger, right? I get done reading Peter Singer stuff, and I'm questioning, the ethics of eating meat. And then I read Nick Bostrom's simulation argument, and I'm questioning whether the external world actually exists. I'm still wondering if that argument has any good objections to it. And today's guest has got me to question something that I never thought I would have questioned, and that's the laws of classical logic. The laws of non-contradiction, excluded middle, all of that stuff, things that most of us just say, how could we ever question that? It's the foundation of everything we believe. And yet our guest today has put forth some theories that just boggle my mind. And so we have philosopher J.C. Beall. Dr. Beall is O'Neill Family Professor of Philosophy at Notre Dame and has written a ton of publications, a ton of works. I mean, you want a CV to drool over, you check out Dr. Beall's website. But today we're going to focus on his new book that's coming out from Oxford University Press sometimes this spring, and that's The Contradictory Christ. And so, Dr. Beall, before we get going, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's really an honor to have you on here. How you doing?
I'm doing well. It's very good to be here. I think you guys are doing a good thing with this. It's an interesting conversations, and so I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, it's an honor to have you. And normally Tyler starts, but I'm way too excited today, so I'm gonna start in. I'd love to hear first, before we get into the details of the new book and some of your arguments. I'd love to hear your story, your journey from, I'm assuming from what most of us accept, especially when you start philosophy, the classical logical approach, right? That foundation to analyzing different philosophical theories, to the more paraconsistent, subclassical logic. Maybe could you give us a little sort of backstory into how your reasoning has changed over time there, if it has?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's as you predict. I was raised with a lot of Christian theology, including a lot of sort of Calvin kind of stuff, and so you start thinking about a lot of philosophical questions and theological questions, and some of them just you have trouble making sense of things. I mean, they look to be contradictory, or they look like they just look strange, but you have no real sense of, you haven't worked out a theory of logic or anything like this. And so, I mean, I'm the type who, I enjoy learning new things. I want to get at the truth of things. And if I can't figure it out, I just keep looking and listening and so on. But I never really developed a theory of logic. And then when I went to university, I just got the, usual first book off the shelf, like everyone else does in their first course in logic. And this is just the standard so-called classical account. But very few logic teachers point out that this was developed largely as an account of the logical vocabulary in standard mathematics. You know, Russell, Whitehead, these are all mathematicians, Frege, others. And so it was to give an account of the logical vocabulary in our true mathematical theories. But of course, if you think about the vocabulary used in your first logic class, you never have things like God, let alone some of the complicated properties of God. You never have things like truth. You know, you don't have truth predicates floating around. You don't have provability predicates floating around. You just have very sparse vocabulary. And everything seems to be right. I mean, it seems, yeah, that follows from that. Yeah, given, yep, sure, yep, no problem. But then when you start to reflect a little bit on the broader world, especially that beyond mathematics, you know, you start to see that there are things that are highly complicated. Take an example that's been discussed by a lot of people working in so-called non-classical logic, truth predicate alone. As Tarski pointed out, right? Tarski, he was a logician, and he was committed to the classical account of logic as the proper account of logical consequence. But he said, this means that truth, as it works in natural language, we can't really make sense of it in terms of if we hold to the classical logic account. So he said, and we won't bother. Instead, he tried to explain how you could have truth predicates for cleaned up theories that don't have all the resources of natural language. And he gave an account of that. And we don't have to get into the details. And the more I reflected on things, and the more I reflected on why we hold that classical logic is the right account of logical consequence, it just became apparent to me that the only reason we hold it is that we never saw or ever really explored other accounts. And when you do, you start to realize classical logic certainly gets some things right. But in my view, it says it goes too far in what it classifies as logically valid. It validates certain things, certain patterns, certain logical forms, certain arguments, inferences, whatever you want to say. It validates them on the authority of logic. And I think it just validates them because it's ignoring important possibilities. So, and the more so, and I developed, the more I thought about this, the more this seemed right. So I think classical logic is, the reason we all embrace it is that we often deal with theories where we see no problem in ignoring, let me call them non-classical possibilities. Many of our theories don't need, as far as we can see, there's no real problem in ignoring these things, things that would be against the classical space. But that's just like, as you said, that would be like saying, well, there's no such thing as a good tasting vegan burger. Well, there are. It's just that you don't see any reason to sort of actually dive in and get at them. And I really believe it's that simple. I think people just, they believe that the classical, the standard mainstream account is the right account simply because that's what they were taught, and they haven't explored other things. But when you do, so a subclassical account of logic is one that's either properly weaker than the classical account, or let me just define a subclassical logic as one that says all of the anything that's logically valid is classically valid. But there are some patterns that are validated by classical logic that are in fact invalid. They might be valid for a particular theory. Remember, when we're theorizing, part of our job is to figure out what the relevant logical possibilities are for the theory. Which ones are theoretically impossible? Which ones are theoretically possible? In mathematics, as standardly done, we rule out anything that might be both true and false or anything that might be neither. And we simply focus on the standard classical possibilities. That's fine. And that doing so will validate those classical patterns for the logical vocabulary. But if you want to give an account of logic that accommodates all of reality and not just the sort of little clean bits, then it seems to me you have to go to a subclassical account. So that's sort of, and I came to that realization through reflection on other things. So.
Yeah, that is really, really good. Thank you. It's just so fascinating. And so is it right to say that what determines the move or the move to a subclassical logic where we're going to weaken the basement level logical entailments is theory specific? So is it right to say that it's the theory that's going to dictate the move, right? So you talk about theology, and we'll get into that right after this. Theology seems like a perfect place to weaken the logic, especially if we're talking about God, because we would expect that our concepts and our logics and everything wouldn't fit neatly into our everyday mundane experience of the world. And I'm saying that to say, our classical logics. I mean, I guess the question is it the theories that dictate this?
It's in our specific theories where this point is reflected. But I mean, the idea that our theories dictate, what counts as logic can be understood in a way that I think would be misleading. Like, that shouldn't be understood as sort of some sort of relativism or anything like that. Reality is reality, truth is truth. None of this sort of, true for this and true for that. I mean, so logic is completely universal. So by which I mean, whatever the true account of consequence is, or logical entailment, that's the account across all true theories, no matter what the topic. So it's universal in that way. However, when you look at logical vocabulary within different theories, take focus on negation, which is sort of logic's, not sort of, I think it is logic's falsity operator. It's false that. That can behave differently in different theories. But the explanation is really straightforward. The theorist, in response to the phenomenon that the theory is about, the theorist rules out some of the logical possibilities that logic provides as theoretically impossible. So those logical possibilities that can count as counterexamples to the logical validity of an argument, if they're rolled out within a theory, then they still count as logical counterexamples, in the right account of logical consequence, but they're not even seen as potential counterexamples for what the theory validates. So it's really that reality dictates which which patterns are validated within a theory. Logic validates some patterns, and that's true across all theories. They are always valid in every true and complete as possible theory. It's just that logic validates fewer patterns than the mainstream view of it holds.
Great, great. And so you're kind of laying out the framework now of the nuts and bolts of your argument in your upcoming book, The Contradictory Christ. And I believe this is based off of the symposium in the Journal of Analytic Theology, right, where you argued for this view. And so maybe can you just lay out sort of your thesis for the book and how this subclassical logic applies to theology more specific, more broadly, and I believe the incarnation more specifically?
Yeah, will do. And please, either one of you, just sort of stop me, because I have a tendency to try to answer all the possible questions around the one question, and so I can just go on and on. So please just say, hold up, like you answer my question.
Oh, Dr. Beall, you go, bro. You go.
So yeah, look, the Contradictory Christ. It overlaps with my work in that Journal of Analytic Theology symposium, though. And based on it, I don't know. I mean, the whole project that just sort of came out first, and it got a lot of the interaction there fed the book. So yeah, but look. So the book, The Contradictory Christ, it has, its central thesis is very simple, namely that Christ, the incarnate God, is a contradiction, is a contradictory being. What do I mean by that? I mean, we've heard theologians, and say, well, the contradictions, the mysteries of God and all this stuff. But I'm not talking loosely, and I'm not speaking metaphorically, and I'm not sort of making up new language. By contradiction, I simply mean a statement of the form P conjoined with its negation, not P. So, I mean, very explicitly said, where P is any sentence, a contradiction is going to be, it's true that P and it's false that P. When I say that Christ is a contradiction, I'm speaking sort of a little bit derivatively. Christ is a contradictory being if and only if there's some contradictions true of Christ. So the simple thesis of the book is that there are contradictions true of Christ. And why do I think that there are contradictions true of Christ? Well, I'm certainly no historian. I wish I were more historically informed, but I've done my best to look at the history of Christology, and really look at the history of Christology, that is the study of Christ, or the account of Christ, and you have the whole gamut of responses trying to. It looks as if every single view sees the apparent contradiction, and yet every Christology is an attempt to sort of get away from the contradiction one way or the other, including, importantly, the heresies. So obviously, if Christ is actually two persons, there's no contradiction, right? Christ, the one person, the divine Christ, is God and has all of God's limitlessness. And Christ, the human person, is human. False that Christ, the human person, is God. And Christ, the human person, has all of the limits that we do, that human beings do. No problem. Not even a hint of contradiction. But of course, that's judged to be heretical. And it's not judged to be heretical because, you know, there's something bad sounding about it. It's judged to be heretical because it's not the view of Christ that's taken to be true by the tradition. There's one person and one person only who is God and who is a human. And so you say, okay, one person has to be there. So you're back to the contradiction. So now, well, then maybe say, okay, not really human, just looks like human. After all, God can do anything, including appear for like a human, do like, you'd never be able to tell. This is God appearing to be a human. You're never going to get a better lookalike. So no contradiction because Christ is just God, not really human. Just looks like it. That too, judged heretical. And then the other way, well, really a human, very important human, representative of God, but not God, of course. And of course, this is what Muslims and Jews say, right? We all share the traditional monotheism, but Jews and Muslims point to the apparent absurdity of saying that God could be human. Not sort of human, not kind of human. Human, like you, like me. And they're just, you know, and so they rightly say this is contradictory, or you're just playing with language. You're just sort of twisting language to make it sound, who knows why, interesting. And so on. And you can, you know all the different things. I mean, it looks like, look, theologians sometimes talk of the incarnation being the radical event. Why? Because it brings divinity and humanity together. Sometimes you hear them say it brings transcendence and immanence together. And sometimes this is just flowery and all that. But actually it's, you know, when you think about the literal import, the truth of it, it's, you almost say, well, they can't mean that, right? I mean, this is just a contradiction. So the simple thesis of the book is that no, it really is a contradiction. The only way you bring divinity and humanity together, full divinity, this is God. This isn't like, you know, this isn't like, well, God sort of, God's pinky, like, you know, it's just sort of some sort of kenosis that allowed this one little pinky part to run around in flesh or something. No, this is God. And yet this is a human. This is a human as much as you and I are. You know, last night it was lightning and thunder. And I didn't sleep terribly well, right? I woke up, was kind of tired. Christ went through that. Everything that you go through, Christ got that. And notice, you couldn't really appreciate you couldn't experience that without having our limitations in full. If you were God, and you had all of God's omniscience and all these divine properties, those properties, if they're not false of you, you cannot have our experiences as limited, our epistemic limitations, the frustrations of that. You can't have them unless those properties are false of you. But of course, nobody should listen to, let alone worship Christ, unless he has all those properties. So, I mean, look, the simple thesis of the book is that very sincere and extraordinarily smart Christian theologians and philosophers throughout the ages have recognized the apparent contradiction of Christ, just as Jews and Muslims and non-theists Everyone's like, what are you talking about? That's contradictory. Or they simply take you to be not really meaning divine when you say Christ is divine, or not really meaning human. But if you say that Christ is fully human, fully divine, you're not playing with your words, it looks to me like you've got the contradiction that everyone says you have. And the simple thesis of the book is that's the truth. And part of me also, I told you to cut me off, but part of me also thinks, what else would you expect? I mean, this is eternal divinity. This is God in eternity. And yet, this is a human with all the contingencies, all the limitations, all this. It's like, it sounds contradictory to absolutely everyone. Unless you're so steeped in your own theory and your own, but the simple story is it sounds contradictory. And the point is, you really have to twist around to try to get away from the contradiction. But I really think this is exactly what you'd expect. The only way you could bring divinity and humanity together in one person is via contradiction. And notice, this view is the simplest explanation for why everyone sees the contradiction. Because it's true. All right, so that's a sort of bit of a rambling response to the very simple thesis. But I can state the thesis simply. Christ is a contradictory being, by which I mean some contradictions are true and false of Christ.
Well, and when you lay it out like that, it's so fascinating. It seems so right. I mean, you're right. When you're talking about God, when you're talking about the nature of God, if you're ever going to expect a place where there's going to be true contradictions, it's here. And one of the chapters in your book that I love was the benefits of holding to such a view, right? Because you talk about the fancy footwork that you have to do with trying to make the incarnation orthodox and at the same time logically consistent under classical logic. And you talk about the metaphysical benefits, right? You don't have to make any of these fancy moves. You don't. So maybe before we get into the objections, can you just go through, let's just go into the objections. So a lot of benefits to the view, the metaphysical benefits certainly being one of them. What do you find to be the toughest objections to this, to your theory?
Well, I think part of it is it's still new enough that there aren't. I think it's still new enough that the weightiest objections have yet to come. That's not to say there aren't any good objections, but I do want to flag that. But so far, I mean, there are a couple objections that are objections to any would-be contradictory theology, Christology, or theology generally. And then there's one sort of more specific to what I'm doing, and I'll mention that in a moment. But so two, like one is, and Andrew Torrance at St. Andrews was talking. We were talking about this, and he said that he does see how it looks like our by the way, don't take this as a record of his official views. This was a conversation. I just want to be clear. But he was saying that he sees that we might be stuck. You wouldn't want to just say that. Just as you wouldn't want to just say that Christ is human, you wouldn't just want to say Christ is God, because you'd be missing an important part of the truth. So too for any of the sort of divine properties and human properties. But he says that he thinks that the reality itself can't be contradictory, and to think that, so he thinks it's part of the contradiction may just be in our way of describing. This is not, a lot theologians and others have said we're stuck in our language and we can't describe the reality well. And I don't think Andrew was quite in that traditional camp, but his point was there's something bad about saying that God is contradictory, in as much as Christ is God, second person of the Trinity. To say that God in reality is contradictory, this strikes Andrew as something that's has problems. But my own view is that I think that this worry is just coming from just training. It's sort of a sociological thing. I don't think, look, if the reality really is contradictory, why should it be bad to say that? So if the idea is, well, I think it sounds bad, but that's because I won't allow myself to think the reality is contradictory. It's something like that. Similarly, Thomas McCall has said things along the lines of, he's open to a contradictory account of Christ. I mean, the sort of radical uniqueness of Christ it wouldn't be surprising if it were really different from a lot of other phenomena that can all be fully and truly consistently explained. But he said, we should not embrace a contradictory account of Christ unless it's a last resort. And again, this to me is just, I think that this just is a reflection of, again, a sociological thing. Like all of us, he was raised in the mainstream account of logic and hasn't had time to fully really sort of work with a different account, a strictly weaker account is all. And so I think he thinks it's really, really sort of just too radical or something like this. But I think that this is just, if you spent, 15 years thinking about the best accounts of logical consequence, I think you'd probably think that one of these weaker subclassical ones is the best account. And once you do, then why should you think that this is such a radical thing? I mean, it's radical in the sense that, or it's highly devious in the following sense, that it deviates strongly from the mainstream. But so what? I mean, you look around at other phenomena that you see every day, and you think, boy, it'd be good if we deviated from the mainstream. I mean, okay. So those are two kinds of objections that I think are just, they're one sort of objection, they're more that are based from just sort of a particular diet. Let's put it that way, okay. But then there's another one that's very specific by Tim Pawl, and Tim says, as a matter of fact, on your interview with him, Tim says that he's like, look, you have all these very sincere, devout, truth-seeking theorists at the councils and all that. Forget about all the, a lot of people like to explain the councils as a result of political and social sort of trade-offs and this and that. I'm sure there's some of that. But look, either you take it and you trust that that's the sort of account, that's the full account, or not. I'm not conciliar in the way that Tim is. I mean, Tim, anything in the, whether creedal, doctrinal, or just sort of, if a shopping list happens to talk about Christ, then it's, it's true. That's sorry, that's more for Tim. You can cut that. But Tim says this, that these, some of these writers, they say things like Christ can suffer and can't suffer explicitly. And he's saying, but surely they can't mean what that standardly means. So his whole project is to try to figure out what they could have meant in a way that doesn't give you the contradiction. And he says that, well, I know that you're familiar with his account. He gives this alternative sort of account of what it is to suffer and what it is to not suffer. And this is basically, to suffer is to have a concrete nature. Notice the very firm commitment to a specific metaphysical view. Just to resolve the problem and get at the truth of Christ, you got to commit to this metaphysics and this and that, which strikes me as a bit much. But anyway, according to Tim, to suffer is to have a concrete nature that suffers. To not suffer is to have a concrete nature that can't suffer. Sorry, I didn't speak well. So, you can suffer and not if you've got two concrete natures. One actually can suffer and the other can't. Sure, but why not just say that then? When you're apparently contradicting yourself, why not just say, oh, and of course, we just mean the one thing suffers and the other doesn't. And of course, those two things, by the way, are not Christ. Even Tim admits that. Those two things that suffer and can't suffer, those things are not Christ. They're not identical to Christ. Otherwise, you get the problem back. It collapses. And I think, or you get Christ as a contradiction a different way. But anyway. Okay, so he says to me, hey, look, it's clear that you're not taking the councils and the tradition seriously. I am. I mean, I think that this account is the right account even for conciliar, the conciliar tradition of which Pawl is part. Tim Pawl, by the way.
Can I ask a question, a follow-up, sort of in reference to the interview that you referenced, where Tim Pawl says that he doesn't know what it would mean to say that Christ's hand was pierced. His hand or wrist, whatever, had a nail in it, and because it's both true and false. So really, what would you see, right? And so I was curious to see what sort of response you'd have to that.
Tyler, can I answer that in 1 second?
Sorry. Yes.
I was giving Tim's objection, which I think is a good one, based on me not taking the tradition seriously. And
okay. Yes. Sorry, my mistake. Yeah.
No. Don't. But let me just quickly respond, because I think it's to his. I think that it would have been very easy for them to say, and of course, we're not really contradicting ourselves because we're not actually talking primarily of Christ, but these other objects that have the thing. So it looks to me like he changes the subject in that way. We're supposed to be talking about Christ and whether Christ is mutable or immutable. But the other thing is this. He will say, well, they don't have to be explicit. I mean, this is a really going out on a historical, plank that neither one of us are in position to answer. Somebody like Richard Cross maybe might, but he might say they don't have to explicitly flag that that's their usage, the Tim Pawl usage, because it was so common that everyone clearly knew. This strikes me as just incredibly difficult to believe. It may have been common, but for such an important and obvious problem, how did this usage get lost and get rediscovered only by Pawl? There's some stuff that Richard Cross has dug up in the Reformation, but still, the point is, for his account of what the history shows, you'd have to have this unbelievable misplacement of the key to all of these apparent contradictions. And that to me just sounds, I think rather they're just saying, hey, look, we don't understand, but when we say Christ is divine, we mean can't suffer. When we say Christ is human, we mean can suffer. This is Christ. It looks to be a contradiction, yes, but we have to say this. Now that we have sort of better accounts of logical consequence and stuff, it's clear how that can be coherent in a very simple way. Okay, so now back to Tyler's question, which was specifically on the Pawl. Pawl says, look, because Christ is immutable, you can't have a nail going into Christ, and because Christ is mutable, you can. And so you're looking at Christ on the cross, you see the nail, but according to me, it's supposed to be false too that there's a nail there. I want to point out two things. First, as I say in the book that will be coming out, Tim Pawl's assuming an awful lot in the claim that it's false that there's a nail there, and he's relying on a lot of sort of what's called contraposition from, if P then Q, then not Q, you get to not P. And those things are, as I also note in the book, it's not obvious that the relevant contrapositions go through in the case of in the case at hand. So I'm not in fact committed to it's false that there's a nail in Christ's hand, but I don't want to sort of get into the details here. It's in the book. But let's suppose that it's true, okay? That is that it's false that there's a nail there. Again, I want to flag, this isn't really the position that I wound up taking in the book, but let's suppose that it is false that there's a nail there. Tim says, what would it look like? I mean, how I see the nail, but I know what it is to look when you see no nail there, right? If it's false that there's a nail there, I know what that would look like, and it doesn't look like that. You can see how there's now going to be a sort of contraposition type thing. But I want to say, hey, look, you know what it looks like when it's just true that there's no nail there. You know what it looks like when it's just true that there's a nail there. But if it's both true and false that there's a nail there, What does that look like? I want to say it looks exactly what it did. That's what the contradiction would look like, right there. What everyone saw. There was no sort of flickering nail, no nail, or anything like that. It looked the way it looked. And so, there's not a mystery on what it would look like. It looked exactly the way it did. There's a question. Why is it that you sort of have only the apparent observable consequences of the one truth and not the other? Well, I don't know. There's been very little study on the observable consequences of contradictions. And it's going to be hard to do that if Christ really is the unique contradictory being. So you'd have to generalize from that one case. But again, I mean, I actually want to be clear. I don't grant it's false that there's a nail there. That's a complicated thing. And it's spelled out in the book, but it's not, yeah. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, that was extremely helpful. One last question for me. We just had Anderson on last night and talked about his paradox model and so forth. And I know you discuss his work as well. And so I was curious if you could give a quick summary of that, your response, that discussion.
So I really, really like his work. I mean, maybe that's not going to be surprising. I'm not saying that I think all of it's correct or anything, but that would be surprising for any two sort of, philosophers, theologians to think that the other's work is all great. But I really like it. I think I wish that it could somehow be bundled with my book as sort of important required reading. And the reason is that, I mean, I think he makes some mistakes on various things, but they're not sort of core mistakes ultimately. So what I like about his work is that it really makes plain the apparent contradiction of Christ. He also talks about the Trinity, and maybe we'll say something about that because I'm working on a follow-up book now on the Trinity, and we can talk just a minute about that maybe before we leave. But let me bracket out his work on the Trinity. He talks about the incarnation and the apparent contradictions. And I think that much of what he says there is absolutely right. But notice what happens. I mean, he sort of, he says, look, every time you try to run from this apparent contradiction, you hit problems. You either, wind up in heresy or something, or you sort of badly weaken the robust view of Christ that seems to be central to Christian theology. I think he's spot on. So now he says any of the best, and I'm not sure if he means like the true. He must mean the true. It's not exactly clear what he takes the actual theory to be. That's one thing I talk about a little bit in the book. But anyway, according to him, the true theory of Christ, or best if he doesn't want to say true, is going to be one that's apparently contradictory. Okay, now question. What explains this apparent contradiction? I say the reality is contradictory. He says No. Now let me tell you how give you this complicated epistemological story, which may or may not be, by the way, the epistemology and stuff, I think is sort of good epistemology but again, I just think to have to stake the truth of the theory of Christ on this complicated epistemology just strikes me as the wrong step. So I really like his work very, very much because I think it leads us to the door. The trouble is Anderson refuses to knock. And, so in my book, I try to show people that indeed knocking is not only scary, but you can go in and embrace the reality.
So if you're someone like me who is committed to classical logic, you perhaps the best option for me you would suggest is, well, maybe punt to analogical language for the motivation for the paradox model and utilize planning as epistemology and so forth. That's kind of better. You'd prefer me to do that than say, go one of these other routes that is commonly discussed in the literature. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that something like that would be better. Just the analogical. And there's a paper out by Dawn, D-A-W-N, Dawn Eschenhauer Chow in Faith and Philosophy. It came out last year, a plea for analogical something or other. She really makes the case for, like, in keeping with Anderson. I don't think she discusses Anderson, but she makes the case for both sort of P and not P, but says, what do we do? So she tries to go through the analogical route. And yeah, I think that that's better. But frankly, look, I don't want to leave you out in the cold and sort of floundering in the darkness because you've been just sort of taught this thing. I mean, what I really think you need to do is sincerely reflect on your reasons for thinking that the classical logic account of logical consequence is correct. And I will bet you that your reasons are not ultimately, you are holding that theory, the theory of logical consequence, to lower standards than you would to a theory of Christ, to a theory of knowledge, to a theory of goodness and the rest. I'll bet you anything. If you really sincerely, not anything, but I would bet you something small. But on reflection, you would see that you're just holding that to lower standards. Of course, you've got masses and masses and masses of thinkers embracing what you do, but that's not a reliable indicator of truth, as you know. To have masses embrace it. So yeah, if you refuse to knock on the door, to come in, to the nice light, the fire and the fireplace, and there's cocoa and stuff. If you refuse to do that, then yes, stick with something like along the Eschenhauer Chow or even Anderson, but I would think that even that analogical that you said is probably better than the Anderson ultimately. So
seemings are so strong for classical logic. Seemings they move people to say things.
And notice that Anderson has that as well, right? Anderson has that very much. He's like, look, here's one major argument in favor of rejecting that any statement could be true and false. This strong phenomenological feel.
Right.
But come on, I mean, look, this morning, because I had such a bad night's sleep, any phenomenological feel I have is going to be strong and highly misleading. And I mean, you just cannot rely on that. I'm not saying that it can't serve as justification, So if all you're looking for is justification for your view,
Right.
sure, I'm with you. No problem.
Right.
Okay, there it is.
Sure.
But notice you're after the truth. You're not after justifying your views just now. You're actually after the truth. And what I'm saying is, and sorry, I'm not coming down you, but it really,
No, it's totally fine.
really is like, you know, I just think I agree your seemings about this are strong, but this is a sort of false prophet that you're listening to. It might justify your views. I give you that, but we're not just after justification. Justification is ultimately easy. We're not after that. We're after the truth. And that's what I'm questioning, is whether the seeming is actually true.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. We usually at the end of these discussions ask our guest, in reference to what they're working on currently. I know you mentioned sort of applying some of this work to the Trinity. Could you briefly kind of discuss that a little bit, and any other sort of work that you want to mention before we close?
Yeah, I'll just mention that I am working on a number of things, but well, I am working on, so I'll mention two books. One is small. In Cambridge has this Elements series, and I'm doing one on contradiction and Christian theism for that series. And
I hear there's a really good religious epistemology volume in that series as well. I'm just putting that out there.
I'll look that one up. Yeah, I haven't explored that series a ton, but good. I will get that, by the way. No, but the other project is chapter 6 of the Contradictory Christ asks the question that all the readers would ask of the book, namely, well, what about the Trinity? So now you say that Christ is a contradiction. How, if at all, does it apply to the Trinity? And I say a few things in there in that chapter, but the book I'm working on, tentatively entitled The Contradictory God, this is taking as a premise that Christ is a contradictory being. How, if at all, does that affect the Trinity? So the Trinity will be contradictory in some ways because Christ is contradictory, and Christ is a key person in the Trinity. Well, they're all key persons. But it's actually complicated to ask, are there any Christ-free contradictions in the Trinity? Anderson thinks they're good, there are, and a lot of people, but I think it's not as clear. But what I ultimately do is focus on the question of what is the Trinitarian identity relation. So for me, I don't think that logic itself contains an identity predicate. This has been highly controversial in philosophy of logic. I'm on the side where I say, no, identity is not part of logical vocabulary. It's not topic neutral enough to be, demanded in all true theories. But one thing that all theorists have to do is give an account of identity for whatever the subject of their theory may be. And so if you're giving a theory of the Trinitarian relation, you're giving a theory of God, you must specify what that identity relation is. And I call that Trinitarian identity. And various people, for various reasons, have claimed that that is a non-transitive relation, of course. So A can be identical to B and B to C, but not A to C. And I do think that it's certainly non-transitive. But the question is why? Why is Trinitarian identity non-transitive? And of all the explanations that I've seen, I think that the simplest one is the best, and that has to do with contradictions in the Trinity. But anyway, this is a book project that I'm working on, and I hope to have a draft of it by April, and hoping that the pandemic will allow. We're going to do a workshop at Logos in St. Andrews on that book, if pandemic allowing. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, it's been awesome talking with you,
Yeah.
and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, Dr. Beall, before we let you go, just to let our listeners know, we're going to re-air this podcast when the book comes out, and we'll do a book giveaway with it. And so, Dr. Beall, we'll definitely have you back on too when your next book comes out. I mean, this stuff gives me goosebumps. I'm so grateful for your work. So thank you so much for your time, and really excited to talk to you again in the future.
Well, me too. It's a delight to meet you guys, and keep up the good work.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Beall.
Take care.